$5.2 billion. That's what the United States spent in the first 36 hours of Operation Epic Fury. Precision-guided munitions, each one costing hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars, launched from B-52 Stratofortresses, stealth fighters, and an armada of naval assets at targets scattered across Iran, and a significant chunk of those missiles hit absolutely nothing. Decoys, elaborate fakes that the Iranians had spent years preparing, dummy launchers, false command posts, carefully positioned props designed to absorb exactly the kind of opening salvo America just delivered. The Pentagon fired first, verified second, and discovered it had punched air. Analysts are already calling it the Battle of Decoys, and it might go down as the most expensive magic trick in the history of modern warfare. But here's the part that should keep every strategist in Washington awake at night. While the world watches missiles streak across the Persian Gulf, while cable news runs split-screen footage of explosions and press conferences, one country is sitting quietly in the back of the room taking notes on everything. Not firing a single shot, not losing a single soldier, not spending a single dollar. China is watching this war the way a graduate student watches a final exam someone else is failing. Every flight path, every depletion rate, every political fracture, every ally that loses faith. Beijing is learning lessons that no amount of wargaming or simulation could ever replicate, and it's getting all of it for free. This isn't just a war in the Middle East. This is a live-fire tutorial on how to beat the United States, and China has front-row seats with popcorn. On February 28, 2026, President Trump announced the launch of Operation Epic Fury, a joint U.S.-Israeli military campaign against Iran. Within the first 12 hours, nearly 900 coordinated airstrikes hammered targets across the country. The opening salvo was enormous. B-52s flying from bases thousands of miles away, stealth fighters slicing through Iranian airspace, and 2 full carrier strike groups providing naval firepower. The stated objectives were straightforward on paper: destroy Iran's ballistic missile systems, annihilate its navy, sever its pathway to nuclear weapons, and degrade its ability to project power through proxy networks across the region. An Israeli strike reportedly took out Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei himself in a daring daylight bomb drop in central Tehran. The decapitation, at least in part, had succeeded. But here's where the backstory gets uncomfortable. The Pentagon's own chairman, General Dan Kane, reportedly warned President Trump before that February deadline that the United States did not have a viable military option for Iran. This wasn't some bureaucratic pushback. This was the highest-ranking military officer in the country telling the commander-in-chief that the math didn't work. Trump overruled him, and the person whispering in the president's other ear was Benjamin Netanyahu, who apparently told him what he wanted to hear. The regime is fragile. One hard blow and it crumbles. That same logic had been tested before, in Iraq, in Libya, in Venezuela just weeks earlier, and every single time the reality on the ground turned out to be far messier than the pitch. What makes this even more striking is that this exact scenario had been presented to Biden twice in 2024. Once in April, again in October. Both times, the Israelis pushed hard for a direct confrontation with Iran. Both times, Biden refused. For 3 decades, under Bush, Obama, and Biden, the military establishment had vigorously fought back against Israeli pressure to go to war with Iran. And then, in the span of a few weeks, all of that institutional resistance evaporated. Now we're entering the 3rd week. More than 50,000 U.S. service members are deployed. Over 15,000 targets have been struck. 13 American service members have been killed in action. And an NBC poll already shows 54% of voters disapprove of the war. The missiles are still flying, the costs are still climbing, and the consequences are only beginning to arrive. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow waterway just 21 miles wide at its tightest point, separating Iran from Oman. On a normal day, roughly 20 million barrels of oil pass through it. That's about 1/5 of the entire world's daily oil supply. It is, without exaggeration, the single most important energy corridor on the planet. And within 48 hours of the first bombs falling on Iran, it effectively shut down. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps declared that no vessel linked to the United States, Israel, or their allies would be allowed to pass. A commander stated bluntly that the strait was closed and that any ship attempting to transit would be set ablaze. They weren't bluffing. At least 5 tankers were damaged. 2 crew members were killed. Over 150 ships found themselves stranded, anchored outside the waterway, waiting for a resolution that nobody could promise. Tanker traffic, which normally averaged 24 vessels per day, dropped to virtually 0 within the first 2 days. Maersk, CMA CGM, Hapag-Lloyd, some of the biggest shipping companies on Earth, all suspended transits immediately. The International Energy Agency called it the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. 8 million barrels per day vanished from global supply in March alone. Brent crude, which had been sitting comfortably in the 70s before the war, surged past $120 a barrel before pulling back to the 90 to 100 range, where it's been bouncing violently ever since. In response, 32 IEA member countries agreed to release 400 million barrels from their emergency reserves. That sounds massive. And it is. But it's a stopgap, not a solution. If the strait stays closed, those reserves buy weeks, maybe a couple of months, before the math becomes brutal. Qatar, one of the world's largest LNG exporters, halted production entirely and declared force majeure on its gas contracts. The Qatari energy minister warned publicly that if the war continues, other Gulf producers will be forced to follow, and that the result would be an economic catastrophe on a global scale. And here's the part that should make every American strategist wince. The countries getting hammered hardest by the Hormuz closure aren't adversaries, they're allies. Japan gets roughly 70% of its oil through that strait. South Korea is in the same position. The Philippines, 94%. These are the cornerstones of America's Indo-Pacific strategy, the very nations Washington needs on its side to counter China in the Pacific. The United States set out to weaponize the Strait of Hormuz against Beijing. What it actually did was conduct an act of friendly fire against every energy-dependent partner it relies on for the most important geopolitical competition of the century. There's a narrative that's been bouncing around Washington think tanks, cable news green rooms, and social media comment sections ever since the first bombs fell. It goes like this. Step 1, take out Venezuela's oil exports to China. Step 2, take out Iran. Step 3, China's economy buckles. America wins. Neat story. Fits on a bumper sticker. And it is dangerously, catastrophically wrong. Let's talk numbers, because numbers don't care about narratives. China has achieved an energy self-sufficiency rate of approximately 84%. That means for every unit of energy China consumes, only 16% comes from abroad. And that figure hasn't happened by accident. It's the result of a 20-year project. Massive investment in solar, wind, hydroelectric dams, nuclear power, and the largest electric vehicle fleet on the planet. China's renewable energy production now matches its coal output. They set out in the year 2000 to dominate the electric vehicle market and scale clean energy before most Western governments had even drafted a policy paper. This wasn't reactive. This was strategy executed over decades. Within that remaining 16% of imported energy, oil accounts for about 59%. Of China's total oil imports, Iran supplies roughly 13 to 17% depending on the estimate and the year. Run those numbers through the full chain, and you arrive at a figure that should make every architect of this war lose sleep. China depends on Iranian energy for approximately 1.5% of its total energy consumption. 1.5%. That's the linchpin of a strategy that's costing billions of dollars and destabilizing the entire global economy. And it gets worse, because China doesn't just buy oil through normal channels. Beijing has constructed what analysts call a shadow fleet of tankers, representing roughly 18% of total global tanker capacity, operating entirely outside standard regulatory frameworks. These vessels reflag mid-voyage, rename themselves, disable their tracking transponders, and conduct ship-to-ship transfers in obscured waters off Malaysia, Singapore, and Vietnam to rebrand Iranian crude as something else entirely before it enters Chinese customs data. Since 2022, Chinese customs has reported 0 direct oil imports from Iran. 0. Meanwhile, analytical firms tracking actual tanker movements confirm that over 1.38 million barrels per day are still flowing. Intelligence estimates suggest up to 300 million barrels of unsold oil sitting on those shadow tankers right now, forming what amounts to a floating strategic petroleum reserve. Combined with onshore reserves estimated to cover 100 to 115 days of net imports, Beijing has built a buffer designed to absorb months of disruption without breaking a sweat. And here's something that rarely gets mentioned. China isn't Iran's partner, it's Iran's monopoly buyer. 90% of Iran's crude exports go to a single customer. That's not a strategic partnership. That's dependency dressed in diplomatic language. Beijing calculated years ago that a structurally weakened, sanctions-constricted Iran would be a compliant supplier. If they fully capitalized the Iranian economy, Tehran might gain the sovereignty to diversify. By keeping Iran on a subsistence-level lifeline, China guarantees that the oil keeps flowing on its terms. While most of the world has been focused on missile trajectories and oil prices, China has been quietly engineering something that may matter far more in the long run. A parallel financial architecture designed to function completely outside the reach of American economic power. And it's not theoretical, it's operational right now. Start with CIPS, the Cross-Border Interbank Payment System. Launched in 2015, it was initially dismissed as a curiosity, a small-scale Chinese experiment with limited reach. That assessment aged poorly. By 2024, CIPS processed over $24 trillion in transactions, a 43% jump from the previous year. It now connects more than 176 direct participants and over 1,500 indirect participants spanning 121 countries. It's not a replacement for SWIFT, not yet, but it doesn't need to be. It just needs to function well enough that countries under sanctions or worried about sanctions have a viable alternative, and it does. Then there's Project M-Bridge, a multi-central bank digital currency platform being tested by China, Hong Kong, Thailand, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia. By early 2026, Enbridge had processed over $55 billion in cross-border transactions, a nearly 2,500-fold increase since its pilot phase in 2022. Because it uses a decentralized ledger for instant peer-to-peer settlements, a digital yuan transaction between an Iranian entity and a Chinese importer is virtually impossible for the US Treasury to intercept, freeze, or even monitor. The digital yuan accounts for an estimated 95% of total settlement volume on the platform. Layered on top of that is what some analysts call the Kunlun conduit, an opaque, state-backed financial vehicle that channels billions through a closed-loop system. Iranian crude goes to Chinese buyers. The funds get deposited into the conduit. The conduit pays Chinese engineering firms to build airports, refineries, and railways inside Iran. No dollars cross a border. No transaction touches the American financial system. Western surveillance is essentially blind. A separate barter network moves Iranian industrial metals, billions of dollars worth of copper, aluminum, and other commodities, directly to Chinese industrial centers in exchange for vehicles and automotive components, bypassing traditional banking entirely. China promised Iran $400 billion over 25 years in their comprehensive strategic partnership. The actual capital delivered has been deliberately minimal. Beijing wants dependency, not empowerment. But the financial plumbing it built around that relationship is the real prize. Because this architecture was never really about Iran. It was about Taiwan. If the sanctions evasion system China spent years building, the Shadow Fleet, the CIPS network, the Enbridge settlements, the barter conduits, can sustain commodity flows to a state under total military and economic embargo, then Beijing has validated the exact mechanisms it would need to keep the Chinese economy running during a future blockade in the Pacific. That's not speculation. That's the logical conclusion of everything they've built. In the days after the first strikes, the People's Liberation Army did something unusual. It publicly posted 5 lessons drawn from the Iran War. That's not an accident. Publishing strategic analysis in real time during an active conflict is a deliberate signal, aimed at Washington, at regional powers, and at Taiwan. And what the PLA chose not to publish is almost certainly more important than what it did. The first lesson was about the enemy within. The surgical elimination of Iran's supreme leader was possible because of deep human intelligence. Israeli agents embedded inside the country, speaking the language, knowing the customs, knowing exactly where Khamenei would be and when. China looked at that and immediately saw a mirror. Espionage prosecutions in Taiwan have surged from 16 cases in 2021 to 64 in 2024. Beijing is already running a version of that playbook. But it also noticed something else. The CIA recently released a recruiting video specifically targeting disgruntled PLA officers, the ones caught up in Xi Jinping's aggressive anti-corruption purges. The paranoia this creates inside an authoritarian system can be weaponized, or it can lead to purges that gut your military competence. Either way, Beijing has decided that internal security is now just as critical as air defense. The second lesson was about diplomacy, or rather, the death of it. Trump was actively negotiating with Iran through Omani mediators in the days before the bombs fell. Reports indicated that Tehran had agreed to zero uranium stockpiling and full international verification. Then the strikes came anyway. The same pattern played out with Venezuela. Talks one day, special forces the next. Chinese state media published an editorial that cut straight to the bone. Diplomacy under Washington, it said, is not a forum for sovereign equals. It's an instrument of dominant power. A former Chinese military officer was quoted saying something that will echo through every future negotiation between Beijing and the West. Don't assume your adversaries will play by the rules. They may strike without warning, ignoring both the rules of the game and the rules of war. When Xi meets Trump later this month, whatever handshakes happen and whatever warm words are exchanged, that lesson will be sitting at the table between them. The third lesson was about raw firepower. Whatever the moral arguments, hard power determines outcomes. China's defense budget rose 7% in 2026. Nuclear-powered carriers, advanced drones, refueling vessels, electronic warfare systems, all accelerating toward what defense analysts call 2027 readiness goals. But the PLA also noticed something specific about this war, the devastating role Israel played. Chinese military planners concluded that Beijing must prevent Japan or the Philippines from becoming what they internally call the Israel of East Asia, a regional ally capable of being used by Washington as a military staging platform right on China's doorstep. The fourth lesson was about the illusion of victory. You can destroy air defenses in the first hour and still not achieve your political objectives. The historical record on this is unequivocal. There is no example in modern warfare of an air campaign alone producing regime change, not in Korea, where the North was firebombed into rubble and didn't quit, not in Vietnam, where bombing continued for years and America still lost, not even in World War II Japan, where Tokyo was firebombed in a single night in March 1945, killing more people than either atomic bomb, and the Japanese still didn't surrender until months later, after the Soviet ground invasion of Manchuria. Iran is 4 times the size of Iraq with 93 million people. You want regime change there, you need boots on the ground, and even Trump understands that sending an army into Iran would be a catastrophe. The fifth lesson was about self-reliance. Iran pursued energy and military self-sufficiency for decades under sanctions. It wasn't enough against the full might of the American military. But China is not Iran. It has the industrial base, the scale, the technology, and its Beidou satellite navigation system just proved its worth under live combat conditions, functioning perfectly even after the United States jammed GPS across the entire theater. That's validation under fire that no amount of peacetime testing could replicate. But here's what the PLA didn't publish, and what matters most. Operation Epic Fury is a proxy stress test for a Taiwan scenario. Beijing is meticulously analyzing American stealth fighter performance, munition depletion rates, signals intelligence integration, and political resolve in real time. Every precision strike provides data on how the U.S. approaches the degradation of hardened military infrastructure. This isn't a hypothetical exercise, this is the dress rehearsal, and Beijing has been handed the director's notes. The Iranians didn't just prepare for this war, they prepared to make it expensive in a way that fundamentally breaks the math. A friend of an analyst in the defense industry described an Iranian drone recently. Sheet metal, cheap as anything. These things cost thousands of dollars, maybe tens of thousands, and the United States is firing multi-million-dollar interceptor missiles to shoot them down. That's the exchange rate of this war, and it's exactly the kind of asymmetric equation that no amount of military superiority can overcome if the conflict drags on long enough. Iran reportedly has at least 45,000 missiles remaining and perhaps 50,000 to 100,000 drones. The United States started with an estimated 8,000 to 9,000 high-end munitions and has probably burned through at least half. Replenishment isn't like restocking a warehouse. Patriot missiles aren't artillery rounds. You can't surge production overnight. The supply chains for these weapons involve rare earth minerals, gallium, semiconductors, precision components, materials that take months to source and manufacture. And here's the feedback loop that nobody in Washington seems to be reckoning with. China controls those supply chains. The country the US is trying to weaken is the same country that controls the raw materials needed to rebuild the weapons being used to weaken it. Beijing has even barred the export of rare earth elements for military use, which makes replenishment even harder. Meanwhile, Iranian precision strikes guided by China's Beidou satellite system and supported by Russian intelligence have reportedly hit over 27 US bases across the Gulf region. Long-range early warning radars in Israel and across the Arabian Peninsula, the systems designed to give advance notice of incoming attacks, have been systematically dismantled. The US Navy, even with 2 full carrier strike groups deployed, still can't escort commercial traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. In the 1980s, when America ran a similar convoy operation in the Gulf, it had a 600-ship navy. Today, it's operating with a fraction of that capability. China's 2026 military budget rose 7%, and it was specifically designed to exploit this dynamic. Every American interceptor fired over the Persian Gulf is one fewer available for a Taiwan contingency. And as time passes, the depletion doesn't flatline, it accelerates. The Iranians understand this math perfectly. So does Beijing. Both Russia and China have enormous incentives to ensure the United States suffers a prolonged, draining engagement. Russia is reportedly providing significant intelligence to Iran. China transferred air defense systems and long-range anti-stealth radar before the war even began. And as the conflict drags on, that assistance will only grow. The Gulf states were not consulted before February 28th. They weren't part of the decision-making process, and they're paying a horrific price. Their ports are under attack. Their oil infrastructure is being targeted. Iranian missiles and drones have struck facilities across the UAE, with the country's defense ministry reporting it had intercepted nearly 300 ballistic missiles, 15 cruise missiles, and over 1,500 drones since the war began. Smoke was seen rising near the Burj Khalifa in Dubai after an interception. Qatar's LNG production has been shut down. Desalination plants across Saudi Arabia, the systems that keep cities like Riyadh from running out of drinking water, are now potential targets in an escalation spiral that neither side can fully control. And what have American security guarantees actually delivered? The bases that were supposed to protect these countries have turned them into magnets for Iranian retaliation. The interceptor systems that were supposed to shield the Gulf are reportedly being redirected to Israel instead. This isn't abstract betrayal, it's the kind of practical failure that rewires how nations think about their security arrangements for decades to come. Before the war even started, the hedging had already begun. Saudi Arabia deepened its strategic partnership with Pakistan, which explicitly signaled it would extend its nuclear umbrella over the kingdom. Turkey has been exploring joining that arrangement, making it a triangular security pact, because Ankara is worried about Washington's unpredictability too. Both countries watch the United States and Israel use military force with abandon across the region and ask the obvious question: who says they won't come for us next? China spotted this opening years ago. In March 2023, Beijing brokered a historic agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia to restore diplomatic relations after a 7-year freeze, achieving what Washington could not. Chinese exports to the Middle East grew twice as fast as exports to the rest of the world in 2025. Chinese direct investment in the region between 2019 and 2024 approached $89 billion. Beijing is cultivating Egypt as a military partner. It's encouraging joint Arab defense structures under indirect Chinese supervision. And it's selling Gulf states sophisticated drones and air defense systems without the human rights conditions that come attached to American weapons deals. The post-American Gulf isn't a prediction. It's already underway. And Operation Epic Fury just fast-tracked it by a decade. The most dangerous weapon in this war isn't a hypersonic missile or an armed drone. It's a financial instrument most people have never heard of. The global derivatives market carries a notional value estimated between $600 trillion and $1 quadrillion. That is roughly 10 times the size of the entire global economy. And backing that entire structure, approximately $300 billion in actual collateral. For every dollar of real money in the system, there are roughly $2,000 to $3,000 in derivative bets riding on top of it. A disproportionate share of those bets are tied to energy prices. The Chicago Mercantile Exchange is reporting record-breaking volumes in energy contracts. People aren't trading. They're panicking. They're scrambling to cover positions that were designed for a world where oil costs $80 a barrel, not $100 or $150 or $200. Goldman Sachs modeled what happens if oil averages $110 a barrel for just 2 months. U.S. inflation jumps to 3.3%. GDP growth gets slashed. Recession odds jump to 25%. Oxford Economics went further. At a sustained $140 a barrel, global GDP falls by nearly 1%, and global inflation spikes to over 5%. And these are the moderate scenarios. Iran knows exactly how this works, and that's the dimension Western analysts keep missing. Tehran has been operating outside the SWIFT banking system for decades. It built offshore companies. It learned to navigate shadow financial networks. And it learned to play the derivatives market itself, placing bets on the very chaos it creates. When Iran attacks tankers in the Strait of Hormuz, it's not just disrupting shipping, it's moving energy prices. When it strikes fuel storage facilities, it triggers insurance recalculations, freight surcharges, and cascading repricing across every commodity market on the planet. Iran's military command has announced the end of its previous policy of proportional reciprocal strikes. From now on, continuous operations. Their message to the world is simple. Get ready for $200 oil. If oil breaks past $150 sustained, the chain reaction begins. Knockout clauses in derivatives contracts start triggering. Banks that wrote those contracts discover they can't cover the exposure. It's the insurance analogy. Everyone crashes at once and the broker files for bankruptcy. Except the broker in this scenario is the Western financial system. Gas at $8 to $10 a gallon. Electricity costs surging. Fertilizer scarcity driving food prices into territory that doesn't just cause hardship, it topples governments. And not just in the developing world. The people who didn't see the 2008 housing crisis coming are the ones managing this risk today. The derivatives market is roughly 10 times the size of the global economy, and the needle that could burst it is sitting in the Strait of Hormuz. So where does all of this leave us? The United States is fighting a 21st century conflict with 20th century assumptions. It assumed air power would produce regime change. The historical record says that has never happened without ground forces. Not once. It assumed Iran would fracture under bombardment. Instead, the population is rallying around the flag. Exactly as populations under attack have done in every single conflict from Korea to Vietnam to the London Blitz. It assumed blocking the Strait of Hormuz would cripple China. Instead, it strengthened China's hand and devastated American allies across the Pacific. It assumed the global financial system could absorb the shock, and the shock hasn't even fully arrived yet. Meanwhile, look at what China has accomplished without firing a single bullet. It validated its entire sanctions evasion architecture under real combat conditions. CIPAS, the M-Bridge settlements, the Shadow Fleet, the barter conduits, all functioning under a full military and economic embargo imposed on a partner state. It collected real-time intelligence on American military capabilities, depletion rates, weapons performance, and political fracture points. It watched the United States burn through irreplaceable munitions that depend on Chinese-controlled supply chains for replacement. It observed American allies in the Gulf lose faith and begin actively building alternative security arrangements. And it accelerated the construction of a post-dollar financial architecture that makes traditional economic statecraft, the sanctions and pressure campaigns that have been America's go-to weapon for decades, increasingly obsolete.